might not know, we're doing a series of talks, a short series of talks about imagining enlightenment. So the different qualities of enlightenment. And we've been doing that specifically by looking at the historical Buddha and different qualities of the Buddha each week. So we've had talks on the Buddha's strength and power last week, the Buddha's emphasis on friendship and the Buddha's empathy. We've had talks on the Buddha's fearlessness, the Buddha's wisdom. And this evening what we've got is something a little bit different. We've got 3 Sangha members who are going to talk about their own, you could say, favourite or most inspiring quality of the Buddha or of enlightenment. The thing about enlightenment that really inspires them the most, or about the Buddha. So we're going to have 3 short talks. We're going to have a talk first of all by Martin, talking about the mythic aspect of the Buddha. Dayapurna is going to talk about the compassionate aspect of the enlightened mind, the compassionate nature of the Buddha. And then Daniel is going to talk about the mysterious, ineffable nature of enlightenment and the Buddha. So they're going to have these three short talks, and Martin's going to kick us off.
So the quality of the Buddha I want to talk about is the mythic nature. Now, often in our society, when people use the word myth, a lot of people want to use it as another word for a lie. So they might say the idea that we in this society can be exactly like Buddha Shakyamuni is a lie because he was going around with absolutely no possessions, no roof over his head, no earnings, living off the arms of other people. Our society is not built that way, so people might say that that's a myth that we could be like that. Now, I'm sure there's people out there that try and put that claim to the test, and I've got this really romantic vision that there's a homeless shelter somewhere full of men and women in saffron robes. One of the reasons why myth is important for me is because it's one of the ways that we can get to the truth of what enlightenment is and how we can try and make it manifest within our current society. Because I find that myths often hold the truths are a bit too big for reality, because we've got all the different storylines going, all the different people we know, and that general static of being a human that sort of clouds it. But this does come with a bit of a health warning, because whenever you encounter myth, you need to be careful about how you interpret it. So I'm going to start by looking at the story of Mukkulinda, who was the king of the Nagas. It was the 7th week after the Buddha had achieved enlightenment, and he was in the 7th day of meditating, and suddenly, completely out of the expectations of the nature of the time, the rainy season started early. So he's on his own in the woods, nowhere near proper shelter, wearing just a robe. This is actually life-threatening for him. At which point, Mukkulinda, the king of the Nagas, appears in the form of a serpent. He coils around the Buddha 7 times and then opens his giant serpent's hood over the Buddha to protect him. And so the rain continues to fall, and Mukkulinda is there protecting the Buddha until the rains have finished. At which point he uncoils, and then he transforms into a human prince, and he bows before the Buddha. Now, if you wanted to sort of over-rationalise that, which some scholars have, they talk about the fact that in India you get holy men that befriend snakes. Now, you could want to see in that episode that there was actually a physical snake that protects this man from the rain, but there's clearly something else going on in the story, so you're potentially missing out by just ending it there. But on the other side of it, if you wanted to sit there and say, okay, this is an absolute truth, you can start to build this delusion that actually enlightenment is about having superpowers, and every time it rains, your pal, the king of the Nagas, is going to pop up and act as a living umbrella. You can also fall into that trap of saying something is true because enlightenment happened, which isn't actually a rational argument. Now, Sangha, when he looked at this story, he sees in a much more imaginative context. So he sees the fact that the monsoon has started is the whole world being submerged in water, which is often in Indian myth associated with the unconscious. So Sangha sees this as us saying that right at this time we're living in sort of the unconscious realm for the duration of this sutta. And the king of the Nagas often represent sort of our hidden depths, those unconscious forces that are working within us and pulling our strings. And so the fact that it's the king of the Nagas that pops up shows that these are sort of our most powerful drives that we're not necessarily able to acknowledge. And the fact that these drives can not only come to protect us, but as a part of enlightenment is bringing them under our control, having pledged fealty to them, shows the self-control that we need to develop to attain enlightenment. So that's one way in which I find mythic nature important, is because with the scalpel of wisdom we can get closer to what enlightenment might actually be and what it might actually be for us. But another way in which I find myth important is the ability to inspire us. So the story of Mukkulinda comes from a set of suttas called Udana, which is translated as the inspired utterances. And so at the end of each of the suttas there is a verse or a poem where the Buddha essentially does like a sum up of everything that's gone before. And so at the end of that sutta, his utterance is blissful is detachment for one who is content, for one who has learned Dharma and who sees. Blissful is non-affliction in the world, restraint towards living creatures. Blissful is passionlessness in the world, the overcoming of sensual desires, but the abolition of the conceit, I am. This is truly the supreme bliss. Now, we may agree on an intellectual level that we want to sort of overcome sort of these drives that are working within us. We want to overcome this conceit, I am. But that's a huge task, and it can seem insurmountable, especially when, since birth, we're being constantly told this idea that we're separate, we're different, that we need to be focusing on our own development, our own comfort above everything else. And so I find these different myths can often give us sort of a breath of fresh air and the chance to be able to see how we could develop in a different direction. So I just want to reference sort of a few different stories and myths surrounding the Buddha. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the story of Kisa Gotami, a young woman whose child had died and she was unable to sort of deal with that. And so the Buddha gave her a quest to find a mustard seed from a home where no one had died. And it was through that process she was able to find out or engage with the reality of what happened. And we might hear that story and think about how we might purify our speech, how we might work on our interconnectedness so that when we encounter people who are suffering, we can understand how we might be able to offer words that they need to hear to be able to move on. Another story is how there was a forest where a serial killer called Angulimala was camped out, and everyone told the Buddha just completely avoid it, don't go there. But the Buddha, with complete fearlessness, went into the forest and ended up converting Angulimala. And in many ways we could think about the different times where we've allowed sort of our fears stop us entering the forest, and think about how if the Buddha can face that potential death, how we could face our fears and actually convert them and bring them on our side. There's also a tale of how, I believe it was a cousin that was very envious of the Buddha, tried to assassinate him by sending a rampaging bull elephant, which I thought would be pretty effective. But the Buddha, with just pure, sheer metta, calms the beast down, just gets him to stop directly in front of him. And that could get us questioning how many of the situations we're in could we just actually bring metta to it and with acts of loving kindness change it down a different direction. Or we might be like King Ajatasattu. We might follow our guides, our teacher, to the Jeta Grove and find 1,250 monks sitting in complete serenity at the dead of night and start to wonder how we could train ourselves through meditation to let go of all the anxieties that hold us and sort of channel into that rhythm, that calmness. But the last sort of story I want to finish on is shortly after the Buddha's enlightenment, when he became convinced that what he needs to do is to spread the word of the Dharma. He starts off on his path and he encounters a character called Dona. Now Dona is supposed to be versed in all the types of beings there could possibly be. So often when the story is told, the story runs through and says, "Oh, you're a man," and the Buddha says, "No, I'm not a man." He says, "Oh, so you were God then?" And so the Buddha's like, "No, I'm not one of them." But what generally happens is, when the story is retold, is that it finishes with him saying, "Oh, I'm a Buddha." And the moment we say that, then immediately all our conceptions of what Buddha and enlightenment just immediately sort of jump in, and we sort of take off the story from there with a concept rather than something that's being told to us, something that can be explored. So I want to read a translation of what the Buddha Shakyamuni actually said. "The fermentations by which I would go to a Deva state or become a Gandhara in the sky, or go to a Yakar state and human state. Those have been destroyed by me, ruined, their stems removed, like a blue lotus rising up, unsmeared by water, unsmeared am I by the world. And so, Brahman, I'm awake. So, I'm asking you now to drop the idea of Buddhahood that you've built up by coming here and by your own study and look into the Dharma, and think about, for you as you are now, moving from the conditions that you have in place, what would it be like for you to root out and destroy those stems of craving? How would it feel for you to rise like a blue lotus? And what would being truly awake mean for you? And that might find something for you that inspires your practice. Thank you.
Well, I got in here and discovered that I've left my notes at home, which is probably a very good thing, really. So, my name, for those of you who don't know, is Dayapurna, and it means she who is filled with compassion. So, I've obviously been thinking about compassion a lot since I was ordained about a few months ago now, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, compassion. So I'll start with the Buddha, and then I'm going to move on to my reflections on compassion and what it is, what it isn't, how we can perhaps work towards becoming a bit more compassionate. So I'll start where Martin left off, with the Buddha's enlightenment, and how when he'd become enlightened, the next thing was he was asked to teach. So to take this enlightenment out into the world and explain it to people and teach it. And the Buddha, obviously, I mean, this is a big thing, he didn't have to do that. But his great compassion took him down that route. So he goes and he finds his old companions who were on the path with him a long time ago. They'd actually left him because they thought he was being too lenient with himself. He wasn't ascetic enough. So he had to face that. How would they accept him when he went back? So it was a great strength and courage there. And then taking it out into the world. And it was a world of danger, great dangers. He had jealous enemies, suspicious enemies, and you've mentioned a few of those examples again, Martin. So it wasn't an easy world to go out into. He needed strength, but his great compassion drove him on, and that strength that he had, knowing that that was the right thing to do. There's a lovely story, and you mentioned it, you referred to Kisagotami, and rather than just telling her, well, everybody's got death around, everybody's experienced it or will experience it, go and get on with it. He doesn't say anything like that. He just sends her from house to house to find a mustard seed in a house where there has been no death. And she doesn't find one. You probably know the story. And through that, I think it's a very clever lesson because it's teaching her compassion, because it's teaching her that everybody has suffered, teaching her a different perspective on things. She's not now just thinking of her own suffering, but she's witnessed other people's suffering. So, yes, the wisdom of the Buddha and teaching her a lesson through his own great compassion that is just right for her. He's using his skillful means to teach her in a way that she would really understand. And the Buddha went on teaching right up until he was dying. You probably know on his deathbed he was teaching even then. So a life full of compassionate teaching, rather than just enjoying his own enlightenment, if that would be possible when you were enlightened, I suppose it would. And a final thing I'd like to just say about the Buddha, our Buddha here has got his left hand in that position, and those of you who were here when we were talking about the refuge tree will probably know that on the refuge tree, the picture of the Buddha in the centre, he has a begging bowl in that hand, and out of that begging bowl is growing a lotus, a white lotus, which symbolises compassion. So the Buddha is really, really aligned with compassion right through. And it strikes me that if the lotus of compassion is growing out of wisdom, compassion must be pretty important in that route to enlightenment. I don't think we can do it without compassion. And so when I got this wonderful name, I began to think, well, what is compassion? What isn't it? And I started to think of one or two things that I thought that it wasn't. I think it isn't compassion when I look at pictures of Syria, and I probably feel a bit, I feel compassionate to a certain extent, and then something else kicks in, which isn't compassion at all. It's worrying about whether we'd get any repercussions here. And I think about my little grandson. And then I realise what I'm doing, and I think that is not compassion. Because that is self-referential. I'm looking back to me, how I would feel. And I don't think it's really compassion when I'm doing things for people because I feel I should do. It's out of a sense of duty, or there are things that I have to do. Because then I'm feeling resentful, or I might be feeling a bit angry about it. And again, it's not the spontaneous compassion that the Buddha was experiencing. So what I do about that is I think I'm a human being, and I give myself lots of self-metta. So I start with compassion for myself. And it's not letting myself off, but it's understanding where I am now, giving myself lots of self-metta, and just trying again, and trying to notice when it is that my so-called acts of compassion actually have a lot of myself in it, one way or another. So that's what I'm trying to do. And then I think other steps I could take are doing that lovely gratitude exercise that we do in your beginner's course, where we write down, you probably know the one, where we write down the names of people who have helped us, people we're grateful to in our lives. Or it could be that exercise where we write down all the people that have helped put our muesli on the table. And you sort of suddenly really get the sense of interconnectedness and the way that people really work together. And I find that helps a lot when I think about that. So those are all little things that I do to try to get me a little bit further away from just thinking about me into a bigger perspective, and really, feeling grateful to other people and noticing how much they have to do with my life. So, going back to compassion and what I can do to try to develop it, and what I think we can all do. So we're not enlightened, and I think that our 5 precepts give us a jolly good place to start from. So there's kindness, generosity, they're obvious qualities that work towards compassion. And then I think the others are really working towards it as well. Contentment. So if I can really work on myself with self-metta and develop inner happiness, a sense of contentment, not wanting to grab, not wanting to push away, but a contentment that comes from inside, I think that's really helping. Our speech precept as well. That would be compassionate towards other people and towards ourselves if we can just follow our speech precepts. And awareness. If we're to take it down to basics, if we're not drinking and if we're not on drugs all the time, we're going to be able to be much more aware of other people and how we're treating them and what their needs are. So I think there's a lot we can do with those precepts. And I thought I'd just mention one example where I had a chance to be compassionate, and it was difficult because I was a bit nervous of it. And for Daniel last week, he was talking about strength and how important that is, wasn't he? And I was thinking, I needed some strength there because I was a bit nervous of it. I was in the hospital with this broken knee, and I was going to have my operation the next day. And it was a little room, it was in Spain, a little room, and there was one other person in the room. And I'd heard during the day she was there. I think she was there. She had various things wrong with her, but I think she was also beginning to lose her mind. And I think she was frightened of that. And when her family went home, families in Spain seem to stay in hospital all day long looking after their relatives. It's so lovely. I think that's compassion. And when her family went home at about 10 o'clock at night, she was on her own. And her son had pulled a curtain that was between us so that it came down sort of across between us. And I heard her crying. And I thought, I want to reach out to her. But I was a bit nervous. I thought, will she understand my Spanish? Which would be a real, if she didn't, my pride would be really hurt. Will I understand her? If I don't, my pride would be really hurt because I've done a lot of Spanish in my life. I should know it. And I thought, will she want me to? What if she rejects my reaching out to her? And I just pulled the curtain very gently, and she didn't stop me. And I found that her hand was over the rail. She got a rail on her bed so that she didn't fall out. Her hand was over the rail of the bed. So I just took it and squeezed it. And I said her name. And she looked at me, and she stopped crying, and we began to talk. And it was absolutely lovely. And in the end, we were laughing because she told me how she'd been in for a broken knee, and how that was about 4 years ago, and how all the specialists in the hospital were knee specialists. And after 4 weeks, she'd run home with no crutches out of the hospital. And the specialist who had treated her said he'd never seen anything so wonderful in her life, in his life. And we were laughing at that. And I just thought, yeah, it worked. I swallowed that difficult bit and I reached out, and it was really worthwhile. And the next day, it kind of came back to me because she told her sons about how we got on well. And they brought me fruit. And we landed up when I left the hospital a couple of days later. I had an open invitation to their house. So, they were being compassionate back. And I just thought that was absolutely wonderful. So just going outside my comfort zone really did wonders. Yeah. And so I just really think that compassion is such a very valuable thing. I'm going to say more, and I can't remember what it was now. My mind's gone completely blank, but I think that's probably a good place to stop anyway. And just seeing if we can push ourselves that little bit further. Oh, I do want to just mention finally, if I've got time, a couple of weeks ago, Amoga Vamsa and Satyajoti, if you were here, got us thinking about kindness, acts of kindness that we'd done or we had experienced, and how we felt about it. And in the group that I was in, we certainly talked about how we felt about that. And we used expressions like it made us feel warm, it took us out of ourselves, we felt that we were more one with the person that we're being kind to or that was being kind to us. So it breaks down barriers between us. And I thought, this is surely going to help us towards enlightenment, because if kindness and any of those precepts, if we are really being kind to others, thinking about others, then we are gradually breaking down those barriers. We're seeing things from other people's perspectives and not always from our own. And surely that's partly, well, mainly even, what enlightenment, from where I'm sitting anyway, is all about, this expanding our consciousness to include all other people, not just selected ones, not just our families, but everybody, and to break down those barriers between ourselves and others. And I think working away at the beginnings of true compassion is perhaps a very good way of getting there. So I'll stop there. My one little thing. I opened this, it was a gift here for me today, and it's by Gorky, I hope I pronounced that, my Russian shows my ignorance, called My Childhood, and apparently it's all about compassion. So I thought, what a lovely gift to be given today. So see what that's like, and I would probably recommend, if you want to know about compassion, I think this might have a lot in it too. Thank you, Daniel.
So yeah, tonight's series of talks comes under this title of Connecting to Enlightenment. We've each been looking at how we can sort of develop our sense of what enlightenment is, what it might mean through reflecting on the great qualities of the Buddha, some of which have been explored by Dayapurna and Martin. And in preparing for my own talk, I sat down to reflect on my understanding of what enlightenment is. And I was struck overwhelmingly by one thing. This is the fact that really I have next to no idea what enlightenment truly is, save that it is deeply mysterious. So it's this mysterious quality of the Buddha and his enlightenment that I'm going to talk about tonight, exploring why this sort of cloud of unknowing shrouds the Buddha, and how we as Dharma practitioners can connect to enlightenment and connect to the Buddha, given its very mysterious nature. So yeah, to begin to grasp the origin of this mystery, let's, as the other two have done, go back to the Buddha of the Pali Canon, and particularly in the first few weeks after the Buddha gained enlightenment. So whilst he was reflecting on the implications of his awakening, the Buddha's mind turned towards the possibility of communicating what he had discovered to others. And to begin with, the Buddha concludes, "Enough of teaching the Dhamma that even I have found hard to reach, for it will never be perceived by those that live in lust and hate. Men died in lust, and whom a cloud of darkness laps, will never see what goes against the stream is subtle, deep, and hard to see." So fortunately for us, the Buddha overcame this initial reservation and set out to teach the Dharma. But what this short passage illustrates is the sheer otherness of the vision that arose in the Buddha at the time of his enlightenment, and how far removed and seemingly inaccessible that vision can be for those of us who are dwelling in mundane existence. So enlightenment, it is said, is ineffable, meaning that it can't be adequately described or even perceived using the words and concepts of the rational mind. And indeed, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha comes across as being very reluctant actually to talk about the nature and qualities of enlightenment. So rather than describing the goal, he far more often describes the path and encouraging others to follow it. But this isn't to say that he remains completely silent about the nature of enlightenment. And we can find examples of the Buddha attempting to communicate it through words and images and metaphors. Nevertheless, as Sangha, who set up our Buddhist movement, has pointed out to us, such descriptions are symbolical merely, reflecting, as though through darkness well nigh impenetrable, only a faint glimmer of the infinite light of his realization. So whatever we think enlightenment is, that's not it. It's because enlightenment is concerned with this transcending of the dualism of our thinking minds, so our minds that can only perceive the world in terms of a split between self and other, subject and object. Because of this, the true nature of enlightenment is beyond our conceptual reach. It is, as I've already said, a mystery. And this isn't to say that we can't come into relationship with the Buddha and his enlightenment on some level. So we can certainly begin to do so through things like studying the Dharma, reflecting on stories about the life of the Buddha and the qualities that these stories reveal, and also exposing ourselves to this really rich heritage of symbols and myths that we have in the Buddhist canon. But such attempts to understand the quality of the Buddha and the nature of his enlightenment can only take us so far, and they will ultimately fall short of this ineffable reality. So, for example, whilst it may be beneficial for us to try and conceptualise the greatly compassionate nature of the Buddha, as Dayapurna did so eloquently without notes,
as beneficial that may be for us, our concepts about what it would mean to be infinitely and spontaneously compassionate will inevitably fall short of the reality of the experience, because this experience falls so far outside of the frame of reference habituated by our mundane selves. And this has been summed up really beautifully in a poem written by Sangha called The Unseen Flower. Compassion is far more than emotion. It is something that springs up in the emptiness, which is when you yourself are not there, so that you do not know anything about it. Nobody, in fact, knows anything about it. If they knew it, it would not be compassion. But they can only smell the scent of the unseen flower that blooms in the heart of the void. So in a sense, many of the qualities of the Buddha and his enlightenment appear to us in this way, as these sort of fleeting experiences that might seem quite tangible and graspable to begin with, but then reveal themselves to be something far more complex and profound and unseen. The trouble is, for many of us, this sort of experience is really, really unsatisfactory. So our conceptual minds want the world around us to be concrete and definable, to be in accordance with the concepts that we try and use to make sense of it. And the same goes for our relationship with the Buddha. So we want to try and make sense of him, to understand the mystery of his enlightenment by probing it with thoughts and ideas and theories and concepts. And there's nothing wrong with this up to a point. As conceptual beings, it's entirely natural for us to want to do this. And of course, some ideas are going to give us a better sense of reality than others. But we're deluding ourselves if we think that this is how we will come to penetrate the ineffable mystery of the Buddha and his enlightenment. So at some point we must realise that our views about who the Buddha was and what enlightenment is can in fact place limitations upon ourselves and our spiritual progress. But to give up these sorts of fixed views is not an easy task, because they form such a strong part of our sense of self, and as such we can be really deeply attached to them. And I think underneath this lies this sort of desire to know, to understand, and in a way to have mastery over the world around us. So when we're faced with the unknowable, we can feel uncomfortable, frustrated, even frightened. And what I'd like to suggest is that it doesn't have to be like this. And that rather than being confounded and frustrated by the ineffable mystery of the Buddha and his enlightenment, we can come to connect more deeply with these things through dwelling in and suffusing ourselves with their mysterious qualities. And I think we can do so through cultivating two important qualities in our own lives: receptivity and faith. And I'm going to spend the remainder of my time up here talking about these two things. So firstly, receptivity. And in order to get a taste of what, as the Buddha said, is subtle, deep and hard to see, we must be open and receptive, free from the limitations that our fixed views place upon ourselves and our development. So there's this famous Zen quote that goes, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few." So by trying to set aside the preconceptions we hold about ourselves and our experience, we can dwell with more openness to what actually is. And in doing so, maybe catch a scent of that mysterious and unseen flower of reality itself. So one of the places we can cultivate this sort of receptivity is, of course, in meditation. And indeed, receptivity forms a central part of our system of practice in the True Atma community. So this might take the form of simply spending some time at the end of a sit, just sitting, just quietly absorbing the effects of cultivating positive emotion and calm. And for those of us with more experience under our belts, just sitting can be a practice in itself, one where we simply watch our experience unfold with no preconceptions about what should be, coming to appreciate with more depth and subtlety the mysterious and indefinable nature of our experience. But this receptive stance doesn't have to be limited to meditation, so we can seek to cultivate receptivity in many other areas of our lives. So, for example, we can develop receptivity towards other people through open and honest communication and through an appreciation of their qualities and their efforts. And I think approached in this way, friendship can be a real crucible in which we can come to experience something of the mystery of interconnectedness. You know, to glimpse this illusion between self and other, this false binary. And we can also practice receptivity through just being open to new experiences and new ideas, to the possibility that actually the views that we hold so strongly are not the be-all and end-all, they're not the final word. And what all of these approaches to cultivating receptivity have in common, I think, is the willingness in some sense to give oneself up, to let go of the need for everything to be predictable and definable and known, and to, in a sense, entrust oneself to the mystery of being, to the mystery of Buddhahood, if you like. And so, yeah, it's this sort of entrusting quality that leads me on to looking at faith. So, yeah, faith in Buddhism means something quite different from the usual connotations of blind and unquestioning acceptance of metaphysical dogma that many of us might hold. So faith is actually quite an unsatisfactory translation of the Sanskrit word shraddha, which some of you might be familiar with. And perhaps more an accurate translation of this word shraddha is something more like trust or conviction. So far from being based in this blind acceptance, shraddha arises from one's own experience. It's a confidence in the Dharma that arises from putting it into practice and seeing the results, the fruition of the practice for oneself. And this is something that the Buddha exhorted all of his followers to do. And at its root, this word shraddha means something like to place one's heart upon. And this growing confidence in the Dharma that arises from our experience, I think, allows us to commit ourselves more fully to the Buddhist path, to entrust ourselves to the three jewels, if you like. And I think it's through this commitment that our confidence in the Dharma can further grow, and through which, I think crucially, we can come to accept that at some point we have to place our hearts on the unknown, upon the great mystery of the Buddha and his enlightenment. But we do so with this open and inquisitive nature, rather than with the closed-mindedness and inflexibility of metaphysical dogma. And I think it's through this trusting, confident shraddha that we can learn to hold our unknowingness more lightly, to sort of dwell within this mystery with more openness and curiosity, and just be receptive to the influence of what transcends the limits of our thinking minds. So there's just one other aspect of shraddha that I want to touch upon, and that's the one summed up by Sangha when he spoke of shraddha as the response of what is highest within oneself to what is highest within the universe. And this sounds like a bit of an enigma. Well, it is an enigma. But what I think it encapsulates is the sense that we all have a shard of the transcendental within us. In a sense, if we didn't, we wouldn't have embarked on the spiritual life. And I think it's this affinity, this resonance with the transcendental, the mystery, the beyond, whatever you want to call it, that can give us inspiration and impetus in our spiritual practice, if only we can be open and receptive to it, allowing it to manifest like a deep underground river whose current pulls us beyond. That's one of my favourite sort of metaphors for shraddha. So yeah, I'm going to leave things there, although I could say a lot more about faith and receptivity, and many more people, far more eloquent and well versed in the Dharma than myself, have elsewhere. But I just want to finish by encouraging you all to stay open to the mystery of the Buddha and the Buddha's enlightenment, to sit with an open-hearted unknowing, whilst at the same time cultivating this sort of fascinated longing to penetrate the deepest mystery of the spiritual life. And I think perhaps if we can adopt this attitude, this stance of receptivity and reverence towards the unknown, we might just be able to catch more than a scent of what Sangha actually called the unseen flower, which blooms in the heart of that mysterious void. Thank you.